Sounds
Oki,
good.
Naganago Miko Cheese Chastakom Aki. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My English married name is Michelle Robinson. I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bogani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, composed of the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina Nation. We acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, another English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yola Knives Dene. My father is so Canadian that I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having an Indian Act imposed status card. I acknowledge my Dene lineage and that I was born in Calgary, but my family is not part of the Treaty 7 signatories. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I am a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many horse town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical in creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest and acknowledging your role or my role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I can share what I know as I walk my red road. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today and want to talk, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It is toll free, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you go to hopeforwellness.ca, there's a texting feature. For non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for already showing your support to our show. If you value listening and can afford to give, thank you. For those that cannot afford to give but would love to listen in, I'd like to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. I have a YouTube channel, and I would love to have you subscribe if you're a YouTuber. For podcasts, we're on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. I have to give a shout out to my super loyal donors: Adam, Alexandria, Beatrice, Beth, Brian, Kat, Celine, Christina, Crystal, Diana, Jana, Jocelyn, Judy, Karen, Kathy, Kenna, Leah, Marisa, Melissa, Natalie, Nathan, Rebecca, The Sprawl, Sharon, Tiffany, Vanessa, and Veronica. So thank you all for tuning in. Today I have my special guest who's actually a good friend of mine I've been lucky enough to walk down my red road with, and I'd like to introduce Chad Cowie. But Chad, I would like you to introduce yourself the way you would like to introduce yourself.
Okay. Ani Bojo, Chad and Dishnakaz, Manoman Canning and Dunjaba, Montreal Megwadoda, Mayangadodam. So for my Anishinaabe brothers and sisters who might be hearing, you'll know that I was speaking Anishinaabe. My name's Chad, as Michelle mentioned. I am from the Mississaugas of Rice Lake community, which is near Peterborough, Ontario, also Williams Treaty and Dish with the Spoon Treaty. I currently live outside, well, I live in the Montreal area. I'm a part of the Wolf Clan. I am mixed, because I don't know if this is video or if this is going to be radio, so I know that you can
Both.
see. Okay, great. Okay, so great. I was not prepared for that part. So as you can see, I am stereotypically looking white. That is a privilege that I know that I have in this world, and I acknowledge that. I get to see privilege change as soon as people find out I'm not full white. I watch it change in some people's eyes, their demeanor. So anyone who says privilege does not exist or that white privilege does not exist, I'd like them to walk in my shoes, to actually watch the eyes and watch the way the person's body language and the tone changes when they realize I'm not just white. And of course, I obviously have that experience. I don't have the same experience as someone who is stereotypically looking like a a way that some people think Native people should look, or how Black people should look, or Middle Eastern, or in general. But I do see it change. I watch their way that they interact with me change. And so that's something that someone needs to see firsthand themselves, to realize that, no, they have privilege. My Anishinaabe side, my Mississauga side, because the Mississaugas are part of the Anishinaabe, comes through my mother, which comes through my grandfather, my great-grandfather. I have Irish background as well. I am a graduate of Western University in London, Ontario, down in shared territory between the Chippewa, the Munsee, or the Delaware, and Oneida, part of the Six Nations. I am talking to you, obviously, currently right now from Mohawk traditional territory. So I acknowledge that, and I'm talking to you, obviously, the host here, who is on Treaty 7 territory. I am also a graduate with my master's degree in political studies from the University of Manitoba in Treaty 1 territory, Anishinaabe territory, and Métis territory. And then I'm also a current PhD candidate from the University of Alberta up in Treaty 6 territory, Edmonton, and also Cree territory. My apologies for using the English words. You don't want to hear me butcher Cree words. It took me forever to learn Niiwa. So, to using I can't even say it. I'm still learning the proper term for Mohawk in their language, Ganiyaga, or something like that. I apologize for anyone who's listening who's Mohawk. But I currently am, a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. I am also a course instructor and researcher at McGill University. So I'm coming from there. My partner being from Toronto, French and Canadian. Well, he'll say he is Quebecois and Australian. I'll correct him and say no, he's English and French. And then, so we'll talk about modern straight constructs and how it's more citizenship and not ethnicity. But again, sorry to anyone who's Canadian, Quebecois, or who identifies that way, Australian. But I don't mean that to be rude, but it's more of a citizenship, and Quebec is a whole other discussion because of nation building and whether or not in Quebec sovereignty can override Indigenous nationhood. I wrote a whole paper on that a few years ago. Some sovereigntists did not like that. But so I'm here to talk about pretty much what I've done. I've known Michelle for years. I got to know her through the Indigenous wing of the Liberal Party when I used to be involved. I am now a recovering Liberal.
So many of my listeners are going to love hearing about you and you being in recovery.
I got involved in I started to become more politically astute prior to the 2004 election that brought in Paul Martin's minority government. That was my first real federal election to be able to vote in. And we can have a whole discussion about why I ended up getting into politics, but I got involved probably just before the 2006 election. I joined the party in 2005, and back in the day, you could join the federal and provincial parties, the Liberal parties of Ontario and Canada at the same time. And I got involved at that time because that was 2 years into the new government of Dalton McGuinty at the time, and it was just more where I felt comfortable. I found that there was a lot of ways to move forward, but after when did I retire, or when did I quit? 2018. That's about 13-14 years. I just felt there was no more I could do. There's a lot of political baggage. There are people who were not happy with me because I spoke up, and I took seriously the way the party approached Indigenous stuff and tried to be that bridge, but it was hard with certain people eventually, to be a part of that group who helped rebuild the party between 2011 to 2015, and watching almost everyone I knew during that period disappear. For people who, disappeared during that time as well, all of a sudden come back and then, get first dibs and stuff because of clout, elitism, etc. Not saying everyone is obviously bad involved. There are good people and bad people in all parties, including the Conservatives. Please, people who are listening, don't let your jaw drop too much. But I've met some good people in all parties. But obviously there are a lot of people who are very colonial minded and who don't get it, and who think that they know best for us, and forget that that's been done for us since like 1603 when Quebec City was formed. So yeah.
Well, and because you and I have such a history together with policy, like we are literally in the trenches with people who want to help us Indigenous people.
Yes.
Those well-meaning helpers.
Yeah, and fighting back again. So like when I got involved, it was again right when the party collapsed in 2011. I'd been involved already. I was the youth rep between the Young Liberals of Canada and the Indigenous wing. Prior to that, I had served 2 years. That was my first time really getting involved. Jeff Copenis, who had been around for a long time. He had been a senior policy advisor to Paul Martin. Paul Martin is another reason why I got involved. I really like both of them. Mm-hmm. I got approached to run for the youth position. I did that. And then obviously I was in that position right up through the May 2011 election, which saw the party reduced to third party status for the first time ever. The commission had already started to fall apart after Paul Martin stepped down. Back in 2006, because there was internal fighting between Métis, First Nations, and I would say mainly between First Nations and Métis, because I never had met an Inuit person who was involved until the last term that I was on, when we had someone from Nunavut. Yep. But I went through that, watching that all happen. And then when the party fell apart and people abandoned it, there's a few of us left, myself and Cherish Clark from the Tlingit Nation, and who lives up in Whitehorse. We got together because we had both been on the previous executive to help start rebuilding. And I remember rebuilding right from the beginning and having to fight with provincial wings of the party over who has control over the Indigenous wing, and people being thrust towards us, not because they were actually necessarily good or they knew what they were doing or if they had good connections to the community, but because they had a card, because they had self-identified at times. Yeah. And we that in Indian country, that's not always the best thing, because Patrick Brazeau is a good example of that. So, because every time he'd speak, Kitigan Zibi, the Algonquin community that he is technically a member of because of Indian Act standards, but not well, looked up to by necessarily most of the community. I'm saying that from my perspective and what I've read, but I don't know for sure if that's the case. You'd have to ask Kitigan Zibi about that. But I know every time he'd speak, they had released a few times a notice saying that Patrick Brazeau doesn't speak on their behalf. So,
because I've been like a distant Indigenous, my status card says Yellowknife. I've never lived there. And I always wonder, will I ever say something at a certain point that Yellowknife Denny will have to put out a statement saying, yes, she's one of our members, but no, she does not say in any way represent us.
Well, I think what you said at the beginning, and I forgot to mention that, so I do want to state that again. In no way, when we're talking about any of this, am I talking on behalf of all Indigenous people. Michelle, you were there at that one policy meeting that we had for a candidate in Edmonton when that woman came up to me and said, how do we solve this? And I needed to speak for all Native people. I'm like, no, I can't do that. And she's like, no, you must. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. When I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking from someone who is a two-spirited Anishinaabe, Irish background, who grew up with a single mother in Southern Ontario in my traditional territory, Mississauga territory, but also whose mom was a member of the military in Canada. And I grew up on some of the military bases. So I'm coming from a very mixed perspective, as well as coming where I'm from. My community, according to residential schools and what they were supposed to do, would have been a success story because it had gotten rid of the Indian in most of my community. We have been working really hard to bring back our Mississauga roots. The fact that I can say that I'm Mississauga today is a big thing, because if you talked to me in 1993, I would have known that I was Native. That's all I would have known.
Yeah, I know. Going down this red road together has been really interesting, slowly unpacking who we actually are, hey?
Yes. And so, there's always that question, right? It's, where are you from? That is so important to be able to answer and understand. And not saying that everyone who's not born into their community, who grows up in their community, is not a member of that community. But those people who grow up outside of it still, where are you from? You still identify with where your family comes from, to do that. Yeah. So having just that understanding and I know I try not to be abrasive with people who might say, oh, I'm from Toronto. It's like, okay, where does your family come from though? And most of these people are they're wanting to learn, they're wanting to understand, they're wanting to re-educate, they're wanting to re-establish that red road within their own family that has been lost or denied or hidden because of what some people were forced to do 100 years ago, 50 years ago. There are
20
people
years ago, how many 60 scoop people, right? They don't even know who they are.
Well, people in my community would deny would deny their Indigenous background well into the 80s. So there is that, and people forget that that's recent. Last residential school, 96, millennial scoop still going on. The fact that we are still told who is one of us and who is not. The fact that we have permanent records if we have status. We're wards of the state still. I try and explain that to my students, that standing in front of them as an authority figure, as an academic, as a professor, not that yet, I'm on my way. I want to be professor. I'm still a PhD candidate, so you can't really be a professor until you have that doctor in front of it. But explaining to them that I'm a ward of the state, and yet I'm there making decisions on their life, but yet Canada has a decision on my life, period, is you can watch it click with them. You can watch it turning in their brains. They're trying to understand how that works. And that's usually when I will, talk about, having a number and all that stuff. And I'll be like, well, my number is 162-004-6601. What's your number for your background? That's usually what I lead with people. Or when I don't look native. So you're not native. You can't be. And it's like, oh, what's a native supposed to look like? And that's usually what they're like,
Stereotype. Yeah.
I know long hair. It is where my Irish side comes out. And my hair gets real frizzy. It grows outwards. So a ponytail, long-haired is not an option for me because it will never go long hair. It will go outward hair. So
that's so funny. I always think of Wab Canoe. This is long before he ever got elected, and he was like, for an Ojibwe with curly hair, the razor was the best invention ever.
Well, for those who will see this, like I have my pandemic hair going on because the hair salons that aren't opening until Monday here, and I have not had a haircut since mid-February. So my hair is naturally wavy, so it's been coming in, and the curls are all back in, and I have to. I'm glad that I showered a lot after my hike today, and that my hair is actually good, because if you had got me in the morning, Michelle, it would have been its own monster. It has its own life.
That's so funny.
Those clippers. Size 2 on the sides and a little bit tall on the top is always what works for me. But yeah.
So if that means that you are able to get haircuts on Monday, that means our beautiful Prime Minister's locks are going to get cut, doesn't it?
Maybe doesn't he live in the Ottawa side though?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Ontario's opens on the 15th as well. There seemed to be some hand-in-hand stuff going on between Ontario and Quebec with how things are opening.
There's a bridge that separates you. Like, that's it.
Yeah. I could have walked to Gatineau and just been like, hello, across the river. But I stayed on my little island because I live in Little Perot, which is a tinier island off of the main island of Montreal. And because it has probably it has the best rates of lowest infection rates for the greater Montreal area. And my respiratory issues, because I have, how do you call it? A pre-health condition, or what's it called?
Yeah. Pre-existing health condition. Yeah.
That's the thing. I haven't really left the island. I've only, gone a little bit. So I think 2 weeks ago I went with Dan to go get some stuff from his office in Dorval, because that's where his office was. That was the first time I had been to the main island since March 5th.
Wow.
And then we just went for a hike up near Mount Tremblant because not a lot of people were out there, and we were able to do passes without having to worry about people being too close to us. And that was the second time I've left the island of, or the region that I'm in the greater Montreal area. I wear a mask wherever I go. It's funny, some people are shocked to see it. I don't know why, seeing how Montreal has such a bad level, but people forget that it doesn't just impact people, that the people who are spreading it are young people. Like it's the 20, I know back in April, it was the 20 to 29-year-olds in Montreal who were spreading it.
Oh.
Yeah, because they were moving around. There was no fear. They're like I think they showed in Canada recently, there's that CBC. CBC had posted a thing and had some really good diagrams and graphs and charts that were really interactive. And I think 3% of the population who are 49 and below are who have passed away from it. It's been mostly 15 above who've suffered. But I'm not taking any chances. Respiratory issues, early onset of emphysema from growing up with secondhand smoke. I don't take the risk, or else everything I've worked for the last 15 years will be no point. I'd still like to have doctor in my name before I end up having to journey to the next world.
That'd be tough, man. I've been watching you go through your academic career and such. And it's just not easy. And I think, like, I can't even imagine as a straight cis, the homophobia, let alone the bigger, like you and I have racial battle fatigue and scars together.
Well, the homophobia has not ever really been a thing that I've had to face. I've never had that issue. It seems to be like, I've tried to explain this with students. Like I've maybe in my time since coming out when I was 18, because I'm 36 now, right? Yeah, I turned 36 a couple weeks ago. I keep forgetting that I'm actually that old. I came out when I was 18.
Hey, just kidding. Keep going.
So I've been out for about half of my life now, if I correctly did that right. This is why I did social science and not math. Yeah, 18 plus 18 is about 36, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, people. Yeah, PhD student here. But I've been out for half of my life now, and I've maybe lost one friend over it. I've never really had to face many issues with it. The one friend I lost had a crush on me too. It turned out she was not too happy when I found out. This was back when I was in my early 20s. But
when you were still straight. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I never dated any girls in high school. I couldn't do that. I couldn't date someone if I did not actually have feelings for them. But I was still coming to terms with myself. But that's me. I know why people do stuff. I know people try to fit in. I know people, we're told that it's the right way to be heterosexual is the right way. So people do try to fit into that. Sometimes before they come to terms with stuff, and sometimes people don't come to terms with it. It depends, right?
Totally.
But I've not had a lot of issues with it, but I'm also 6'3", and I've gone anywhere from like 195 pounds to about 260. So people tend to be afraid of my size. They don't necessarily make comments to me.
And I'm in Blackfoot territory, so I'm like the short little Dene that's always hanging out with the natives, and it hasn't changed much when I see you out east.
Yeah, the one who came down south somehow got stuck down there. Pardon me. But I've had to on a regular basis defend being First Nation. That's where I've always faced the issues. My community has been very supportive of me as being out. There's only been a select few people in my community who have had issues with it, but they have a lot of their own healing to do with various items, and it's really only been two people. One who married into the community. But it's mainly been I've had to defend being a status First Nation or defend Indigenous people or defend Indigenous rights. That's what I regularly have had to do in my life. And there's a post from U of Alberta called it's Canada at 150, and I was a guest post, and I had talked about having my intersections, and at Canada 150, people are celebrating 150 years of Canada, and I was quiet because at one point, yeah, I celebrate because I was able to marry the person I love. We were able to have a marriage. We are legally recognized by the Canadian state, but at the same time, the Canadian state tells me who I am. They also can decide what to do with my body when I die. They can decide what to do with my property. They can decide almost anything with me because they're the ones who are telling us who's one of them. They have told me I'm Indian according to Section 27 of the Indian Act. I know I'm Anishinaabe. I know I'm Mississauga. And my kids will be Mississauga, but my kids, whether we adopt or we have biological kids, will be Ojibwe. They'll be Mississauga they'll be Indian according to Indian Act, but they're going to have to make a choice between love or if they're going to want to marry another Native person in order to keep the status going to their children. They won't. They have to make that choice. And it's still weird with how stuff is decided over that because I want them to be able to marry out of love. And so no matter what, my children, my grandchildren, they will know their Mississauga background because that status card is not what makes me Mississauga or Anishinaabe. It's just Canada has unilaterally imposed a system that they've tried to put in to try to say, oh, this is what gives you rights. No, my treaty gives me rights, and they have no right to decide who's a part of that in our community or my nation. They choose to do that. They unilaterally imposed it. And so when people talk about getting rid of the Indian Act, yeah, no one wants it. The question is, how do you get rid of it, though? One side says, yes, get rid of it, but you need to dissect the treaties out of it that Canada has unilaterally put into it on their own choice, which the laws with it are put into place because of the judiciary that Canada has built based off of colonialism. So if Canada's laws are in place and they're the ones who are superior, why would we trust them to dismantle the Indian Act without first protecting those treaties? It's the same thing with the Jay Treaty. So it's not about, the Indian Act is not what protects our rights. The Indian Act imposes who is allowed, and it limits who is allowed to have those rights based on who they think is deserving of it, not based on who our nations are. And again, the Indian Act is who imposes the band council system. Not all chiefs and councils are bad, but they're not our traditional system. And my community, my nation, never agreed to give up our hereditary system. And when we talk about hereditary system, we're not talking about hereditary in the sense of European monarchs, where, no matter what, the king can pass it down to his son, whether his son is evil or stupid or not, or in some cases where it could go down to the queen, or it could go down to a princess. Very rare, obviously, depending on if there was no males there in some cases. But in our systems, it was usually like hereditary. Yes, the chief it could go down to the son, or it could go down to a family member. But most nations, especially out east, had a clan system in place, so they had some system in place to keep it in check. So, for instance, the Haudenosaunee, if the clan mothers did not find that the hereditary chief was good enough, they could remove them. It's the same thing with the Wabanaki Confederacy, which for, a certain liberal counterpart of mine, the Wabanaki Confederacy does exist. And I would hope that he's learned that now, because that included the Abenaki, as, the current female co-chair of the IPC knows, and included the Micmac, the Maliseet, and so on.
Yeah.
Hopefully he read one of the 13 different articles I had to read him when he told me to prove it. There's a sore subject there, but
Dude,
like they had.
I just did a Latin acknowledgement today and was told my English is so good, and I'm like, fuck you. Yeah, so like I feel you. It's a constant racial battle fatigue of proving, and no concept of Indian residential schools, no concept that they have a role as treaty people. Oh, my friend.
But that's also because people don't understand that settler and colonialism does not necessarily just mean white people today. It's, yes, the first were the French and the English in what we now refer to as Canada, based on colonial borders. But especially post Pierre Trudeau, when multiculturalism was adopted and Canada's cultural mosaic was put in place, people forget that you can be any background, even in some cases Native people, who forget that they're part of it because they've lost their identity, or they've lost that connection to it, or they've been absorbed for various reasons. It depends. But they forget that just because someone might be brown, or someone might be black, or Southeast Asian, or even Asian in general, like it doesn't mean that you're not settler colonial. Settler colonialism is not the same as colonialism. Settler colonialism is when you kind of when you join that new establishment. Settler colonialism is about pretty much establishing oneself, putting in new laws, putting in new rules, putting in a whole new naming the place, getting rid of the old system, trying to then absorb what's left of the original populations into it, and then trying to get rid of their difference in identity, simply because it prevents the legitimacy from fully being recognized of a state. And with the fact that immigration opened up to not just allowing English-speaking people in the white English-speaking people in the Commonwealth, which I'm not opposed to. I think it's very good. I've learned a lot from different people from different parts of the world, and I think it's good that you're not limiting to each other, because what happened with how Canada treated Chinese men through the Chinese head tax, how they treated people who are now a part of what is called the present state of India, because India is a construct as well as a state. There are different groups of people who actually are from what we call the Indian subcontinent. India is a construct just like Canada is. The Komagata Maru, what we did with Japanese people during World War II, what we did with Ukrainians in World War I, and so on. And the fact that you had pushback on Black people being allowed to immigrate here, I think you shared the article from Calgary in like 1904, where the mayor was like, told the Black citizens and told the white citizens, get along, and then told the Black citizens to stop convincing other Black people to move to Calgary.
Yeah.
This is like 1904. Yeah. So like this stuff does exist, and we forget about it. But what we forget, though, is that it comes to a point when you're doing the citizenship test and you're joining it. I've heard from friends of mine who are new Canadians, who are in the process of becoming Canadian. They don't learn a lot about it, because there's only one page in the citizenship guide. It's like we respect Indigenous rights and First Nations, Inuit, Métis. It's like, cool, but what does that mean? I think there was a draft to add in that treaty rights and acknowledge that they will uphold treaty rights, but I think that fell apart. Just like Section 35 originally in 82 was supposed to have a lot more gumption to it, but that was put out for the word existing. But settler colonialism is not just a white people thing. This is just general sense of people who buy into that new state that they're a part of. And I understand why they do. They've left, some cases, they've left really bad hardships. They've fled. But a lot of people choose to come here and they forget that that includes understanding that they are on Indigenous territories. Maybe their ancestors may not have partaken in it, but they forget that today they're still agreeing to be a part of a state, and they agreed to be a part of a state, and they obtained the citizenship to a state who still tells me if I'm allowed to be and allowed to have my treaty rights. They're still accepting into a state who can still decide what to do with my body when I die because the Indian Act says so. They're still buying into a state that still has laws on the book that we're not allowed in pool halls, which I only found out recently because of Bob Joseph's book. So 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. I strongly suggest that to anyone who's listening.
You know what the worst is? I have that book and I've been waiting for my book club to get to it so we can read it together. And there are times I just start reading other books, and right now I'm in the middle of gay history of Calgary. So I got to send you a copy because I'm sure you, out of all people, will find it hysterically funny, but sad at times too.
I would very much like to find that out and read about that. It's just amazing some of the stuff that's on the laws in the book. And people forget that in Nova Scotia, there was a law on the books until 2002 that talked about being able to get a certain amount of pounds, like British pounds, from bringing in a Micmac scalp. And it depended on how old they were, if they were female, male, or a child, how much you could get from that scalp. And people forget, with everything going on down with what happened to George Floyd, it's good to see people acting, but I'm so sick and tired of seeing, well, at least it's not like that here in Canada. Where were the complaints from people when in January and February with Wet'suwet'en, where were the complaints from people about people who were, promoting Shoot a Savage Day? Or where were the people who were decrying the person who, said that Canada should napalm Indigenous communities and make us learn our place? There was another person who said, well, let's just cut off everything to them. Then they'll learn where their place is and how lucky they are. Where was the outcry from that? I know someone ran a car into some of the protesters here in Montreal back then, but it's a hard thing in Canada, I think, for people to acknowledge that it is free reign when it comes to Native people. You can talk about them. You can discuss what is okay for them and what is not in general in society, because we're looked at as just things to be administered and things that need policy in place. And that tends to be the problem. And I try to talk to my students about that this is how Indigenous people are approached. And you need to remember, we are human, we are people. And you're talking about us as if we're in far-flung corners of the world, or far-flung corners of the country, not realizing that, I might be sitting right next to you when you're talking about whether or not I have a right to this or that, or that, making claims that I don't pay taxes, or that I have a free education. Ontario student loans will have my soul until I die.
It's true. I don't know anyone who doesn't have like a minimum $30,000, student loan debt issue. And like, that was treaty. It's another issue of broken treaty.
Well, that's the other thing, and some people might not get very happy with me here, but it also depends on treaty, right? Mm-hmm. Some treaties out there and what territory is shared with Alberta go very far with details about a medicine chest, a social services chest, and an education chest. My community, my nation area, we don't talk about any of that stuff, but we also did not give up in any way, shape, or form land rights. We did not give up claims to our water. We did not give up claims to anything. Mm-hmm. So it offsets it still, because if we actually were paid the right amount for using the land that we are on, because we never gave it up, we wouldn't have to worry about that being in our clause, because we'd be able to naturally be able to cover all the costs of it and probably foster people for education outside of our community, or outside of our community. But that's part of the issue with it. So that also has to be the talk when we talk about getting rid of the Indian Act, that we need to acknowledge that in general, people, when talking about getting rid of the Indian Act, they need to acknowledge that when you do that, yes, it's going to open up a whole bunch of different ways, and not one unit is going to administer it, but we're not all one people. Indigenous is a blanket term. I know for people, it's frustrating when they're referred to as Indigenous. I understand that. I think for the progress of reconciliation and learning, a blanket term is sometimes needed. Indigenous is the one that I prefer, because from my understanding, what I've learned about it, it's the term that has been accepted widely by Indigenous groups across the world. There's 13,000 different Indigenous groups that exist still across the planet. And this was the term that was kind of adopted because it was self-decided. unlike Aboriginal, which was imposed by, 13 white men over constitutional discussions in the 80s. I know Métis felt more comfortable with Aboriginal because of the fact that it didn't actually say First Peoples, because I know for Métis, sometimes there's the issue about the fact that, Métis come to exist because of interrelations between French and English and other people from the British Isles, and, and to some extent, the Cree and the Ojibwe. The definition of what Métis is, I'm not going to get into that because...
Oh, we only have, what? I'm just kidding.
I'm also not 18. I don't want to touch that one. So
nope.
Yeah, my people aren't even allowed to decide who's one of them yet. So
and did you know my band actually was considered what did they call it? Extinct. At one point in time, the Canadian government pretended that we were extinct. Can you believe that?
Yeah. Well, there's they do that with there's a lot of absorbing of stuff, and you see it even going on with Trump down in the States. They've just redecided not to acknowledge a group in the East, I think. I can't remember what the group was, but...
I was talking about it in one of my earlier in podcasts, actually, and trying to follow that because, just arbitrarily decide, your tribe's not going to exist anymore.
Settler colonialism.
Yep. So, and it's right in front of everybody, and yet they say things like, I shouldn't be punished for what my grandparents did. And it's like, well, you won't even talk about reconciliation, so why can't we talk about that? Like, why can't we talk about the truth of that?
There's a good post. Let me see if I can find it again. If you don't mind, I'm going to probably pause for here, and then I'll read it. Because it's a very poignant post that's been coming up lately with everything going on. A lot of mostly Native people and friends of mine who have African background or African descent background, they've been the ones to like it, obviously, because people don't know what to do with it. Because people get scared of it. But it was so powerful, and it was so to the point, and it's actually on my Instagram, so I'm going to go to that one. 1 second.
I'm so bad with Instagram, and I need to go back to that because, there's some great quotes that are there. And I'm a real stinker for taking a picture of somebody's tweet. And then, but I'll source it at least so that way, I'm not taking credit for their words.
I saw this post on Facebook, and it didn't show who wrote it. So I put it as anonymous. But to whoever wrote this, if they ever see it, I want to give them credit for it. And I applaud them for stating this. It is so perfect. It says, especially with after George Floyd and the talks that have been going on in Canada, but between what's going on, what happens with Black people and Indigenous people here in Canada. That's been the constant talk here, where both are included, and that's a good thing because they're showing allyship and that, there is a need to bring up Indigenous people in regards to Canada because of how bad things are here regarding us. But if you blame Native American communities for their poverty, remember that the entire continent was stolen from them. If you blame Black American communities for their relative poverty, remember that Black Americans were stolen from a continent, trafficked, and enslaved for nearly 300 years. Tell me again about how your family started from nothing when they immigrated. Didn't they start from whiteness? Seems like a pretty good start. The American dream required dual genocides, but tell me again about fairness and equality and equal opportunity. Tell me about democracy modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy. Tell me your proud heritage, and I will show you the violence that made it so.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and it's not just whiteness anymore. It also is settler privilege that we need to talk about. That is a key. Well, do minorities who live in Canada face discrimination? Yes. Do they face discrimination in the States? Yes. There is a hierarchy that exists, and if you look it up, there is a thing that was posted, and this was years ago, and it's still the same. But if you look at the hierarchy of how things are in Canada regarding race, you will see white Englishmen at the top. You will see white Frenchmen at the top, a second, and then you'll see white women who are English, and then white French women who are fourth, and then it goes down. And the last four categories are African American male, or and then African American female, Native male, Indigenous female. Yes, and I've tried to talk to people about that when talking about how when we were involved politically about how I would go about getting things done that needed to get done. And I would always bring up, because I've watched you struggle to get things through, and I've watched other Indigenous women who are involved try to say the same thing that I'd say. And the way I would describe it is like, if I had something to do, I would maybe have to say it 8 times. Mm-hmm. If I needed it done quickly, I knew to go to a white woman who maybe have to say it 2 times. But if it's really, really important, I knew to go to a white male who was an ally, who would maybe have to say it once. And then when they're like, oh my God, I'm like, that's nothing. I'm like, if you're an Indigenous woman, you're probably saying it 16 times because I've watched that happen over things. There's key things. Some people know how to schmooze better, but for some of us, we just don't have the time to do that. We want things better. Like, we need to have things better. I want things better than they were with me growing up. I want them better than what my mom grew up in. I want my nephews and my niece to have the same benefits as my non-native nephew and soon-to-be niece. I want my niece to be able to know that she could go walking and she won't have to worry about disappearing and it just being assumed that she was a drug addict or a runaway, or that it was assumed that she might be someone who got into sex work, and therefore her life was just inevitably going to be wasted. And that's a whole other discussion about sex work. Obviously, we both have a good common friend, Naomi, who I've learned a lot from on that, but it's also how people are approached about it. There's different ways that certain groups are approached based on their ethnicity and even that work. But I want my nephews to be able to not have to worry about getting called out at a store simply because they show their status card because of how it is in Ontario, because you can do that at point of sale. But my niece especially, like, it's weird with that. My nephews, I worry to an extent as I've been seeing things that have been going on, but they also have the privilege of blending in like I do. My niece does too, but she has darker hair. She has brown eyes. So my concern is just because of where she's from and where I'm from. It doesn't matter if you look at it. It matters based on your last name. They know in Peterborough region that if you're a Cowie or a Howard or a Muskrat or a Potash or a Louse, that you're from Hiawatha, just as they know if you're not Jacobs, that you're from Curve Lake, for instance, or that if you are Smoke, you're from Alderville. They know that in the region. That's how it is based on that, because we blend in a bit. We've had contact since, the 1500s. So there was marrying between both sides, because the idea of being Native and being this blood level is a whole construct by Canada through the Indian Act. It's not how we did things. We always had our own systems. And if my husband wanted to be Anishinaabe, he would have to agree to follow the tenets of what it meant to be Anishinaabe, like a citizenship in a sense.
Yep.
He would be able to still be Anishinaabe. But obviously that's not how it works under the Indian Act. So.
Well, and let's not forget the amount of rape. Like, at the end of the day, the violence against Indigenous women includes rape, and that is, a lot of us are products of rape. So
yeah, sexual assaults, inappropriate touching, and I know they talk about how it comes from people who we know. Well, Native people don't just know other Native people, and people forget that. So I know that's what they've tried to say is, oh, it's an internal issue because it's obviously, and they don't realize that it's more than that. Yes, I'm status First Nation, but clearly I know non-Native people. And I grew up knowing non-Native people because a family of mine is non-Native, obviously. But those concerns alone for my niece, and the fact that, like I said to yourself, like the fact of what she might have to do to be able to be heard sometimes, or if she'll be ignored.
And that's that battle fatigue. I mean, ultimately that racial battle fatigue and sexist battle fatigue, it's so infuriating. Knowing, like, my husband, and I've told him this a million times, because I've run municipally and provincially, and by just simply being an Indigenous woman, my husband, they would love him and vote for him in a second, but I'm Native, I'm a woman, so they absolutely can't vote for me. I was just recently at a Black Lives Matter meeting, and it was really clear they just wanted to have a Black community member as the next municipal candidate. And it was kind of a hard moment, because it's like, I'm not going to fight this, and I already ran, and you don't know who I am, and it's fine. It's so clear. Like, I ran twice. I know what I'm being told. So, and it sucks, because I mistakenly thought, we were in a time of reconciliation and people would want solutions, right? And by somebody who's second generation energy, but apparently not. So.
Well, and that's the hard thing, right? It's, yes, minorities in some places make up the majority, but people forget that does not mean we're all united. And it's that whole divide and conquer, right? The British have done it well since invading the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish. They have been practicing the tactics and colonial tactics that are still in place in Canada, and the way of dividing, we can say, communities. I really despise when I hear someone say, we need to look past all these definitions of each other and, realize that we're all one. It's nice to say that when you come from the side that makes the decision on who is who and who is allowed to have what. It's nice to be from that group of people who have gotten to that point where you can be like, oh, we're all one. Yeah, well, there's still people who aren't allowed to decide who's one of them. And there are still people who have been othered because of that group who is now at that point of saying, oh, we're all one. And again,
if you don't know what systemic racism is, just shut your pie hole, man.
Yeah. And again, that whole thing about there can be laws that say that we're supposed to be equal. That does not mean equality and justice are actually there.
Right.
We can see that with everything going on right now. How many people would you see get a knee put on their neck to be held on over something so ridiculous, compared to if it was someone, Dylan Roof, the person who went into a black church and murdered people, and he was just walked out and he had McDonald's or something on the way home. Yeah.
I just shared that cartoon, and it was him, clearly him with this stupid haircut, eating a burger in the back of a cop car, and a guy beside him who was black, who was beat up, had goose eggs, and said, yeah, I just shot up a church. And the other guy was like, yeah, I had a broken headlight or tail light. And it's it's so painfully clear and obvious. And I'm sure you've seen the RCMP tackle and beat the shit out of Chief Adam. Hey, yeah, seen that
too.
Well, so
as soon as that happened, I had no doubt that there was more tough stuff in there. The training is important, and the level of training that needs to be done, that includes also, in a sense, of counseling or sociological understanding, is so important that they do not get taught. Not all cops are bad, of course. Not all people are bad. Not all politicians are bad. Not all white people are bad. I get that, but there are the select few people who are there, and then there are those who are quiet and don't do anything about it, per se. That's the issue. I know people who are cops who are good. I'm not saying that all cops are bad, but why is it so hard to understand that more training needs to be done in regards to sociological understanding, or even understanding of socioeconomic backgrounds, how to deal with people who have addictions, people who have mental health.
So you're talking to the wrong demographic here a whole lot. So you and I are having these conversations, and the folks out here, they just don't get it. Literally, right now my daughter's having a sleepover with a young girl who, she's the daughter of a cop. Of course I know there's some good cops. But the bottom line is, it's that bigger picture of not all the good cops are kicking out the bad cops. And at the end of the day, they're not acknowledging their bias. I had an Asian immigrant cop look me dead in the eye and tell us that as Indigenous people, we just need to pull up our bootstraps, and Green Party high-fiving him right in front of me. And and that was my, training. I'd done it for a year with them, and they were still having this attitude, still not seeing systemic racism.
To that cop, I want to say, as someone who looks white and who is trying to be an academic, who's trying to teach about this, here's my experience. I've been told not to be emotional. I've watched as an entire classroom in my undergrad debated about whether or not Native people were allowed to have the rights or not. I had my hand up the entire hour in my intro to political science class when we talked about First Nation rights. Well, one side told the other side that I wasn't allowed rights, and the other side told that other side that I was allowed rights. And I'm the only Native person in the class going no, this is history right here. This is exactly what's going on. I was ignored the entire hour. And to that cop, I would say, yeah, we pull up our bootstraps. What happens when we do pull up our bootstraps and we're still not listened to? I will try to talk to people about Native stuff. I will be told I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not Native. I will correct them, and then I'm not educated enough. And then I will correct them again with being a master's student or a PhD candidate now. And I'm told I'm too educated. Or, as you've seen me get referred to as the angry, hostile Native for not shutting up, for being combative, for being difficult. That's the other thing we get told of. Gaslighting. So to the cop who told you that, I think he needs to go up to a northern community and go live in it for a bit and see what it's like, and realize that it's not as simple as saying to pull up our bootstraps. How can we pull up our bootstraps when any economic movement that we're allowed to do is decided by Indian Affairs or Indigenous Services now? I think that falls under Indigenous Services, right? Crown Indigenous relationship is more about forming new agreements and treaty relations, right? But
everyone still calls it Indian Affairs, and I probably will call it Indian Affairs until I die.
So my favorite thing when I worked for a political organization out in Ontario, I'm not going to name names. It represents 133 of the First Nations, of the 133 First Nations that exist. This was after Ontario had established its Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, and it was MAA, which spells out Ma. So when we would talk about them and we would talk about Indian Affairs, we called Indian Affairs PA. So we would talk about what Ma and Pa wanted.
That's so fabulous.
Yeah, they didn't like it very much, but we did. I found it hilarious when I found out, and I've latched onto it. So I'll talk about them like that. But the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs in Ontario is now lumped with Natural Resources, or is it now separate again? I know that happened right after Ford got in, but no, there's too many barriers in place for us to be able to just pull up our bootstraps. We can pull up our bootstraps, and then we could walk holding those bootstraps up a mountain in a snowstorm, and then not have any weapons to fight off other climbers who are coming at us with weapons, or the wild animals who are trying to eat us. Because that's what life is like coming from that.
For Christ's sakes, Jed, I had to have the conversation with Darcy and Samantha. When I have any type of stroke or heart attack, know that if you do not advocate for me, I will have lifelong effects because of the racism I've already experienced continuously. It's almost every time I go into the stupid healthcare system. And I just know that I'll have lifelong effects because they'll assume I'm a drunk native. They'll just assume it.
You'll have lifelong effects if you're lucky enough to survive that visit.
Exactly. And it just sucks.
Well, my mother served Canada for 17 years as a military police officer, a peacekeeper, as a member of the military. In February of 2018, she had a physical. She was told she was fine. End of March, she started to develop a cough. She was told she had pneumonia. She was given penicillin. It got worse in April. She was given more penicillin. She was given more penicillin in May. I remember talking to her when Dan and I were on a vacation, and she was coughing, and it was her. She just assumed it was her pneumonia. She didn't complain. June, she went into the hospital in Peterborough for 4 days because of this pneumonia. Was given more penicillin. My sister had to take her into Emerge because she was having problems breathing. July 11th, 2018. The doctor, thankfully, this doctor knew something was up. Sent her to go get x-rays or CAT scan. One of them picks up on it, one of them does not, but I don't understand how it was missed. She was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. She died 11 days later, and I'm trying to still reconcile with that. If you are diagnosed with cancer in my community, it's most likely a death sentence. There hasn't been someone who's survived in a very long time. I'm very hopeful that we are going to have someone from our community who's dealing with breast cancer now who's going to survive, but it's not because the system caught it early. It was just I don't fully know, so I can't fully say, but from my understanding, from what I this is hearsay, was that it happened to just get caught early, because most people have gotten it later. My grandmother, she went misdiagnosed. She died 3 months after she was diagnosed. It was assumed that she just wanted pills. I remember my mom being quizzed because she got diagnosed on the 11th. I came home that following week because she was supposed to go in for her consultations to find out about chemo, what could be done to give her comfort until she would eventually pass away. They lost her information, so she didn't actually get her appointment. Her appointment was on the 23rd, and she died the 22nd of July, 2018. She had to go into the hospital earlier a couple of days before that because she was having problems breathing. The doctor in the ER, this was a different doctor, was so rude with her, made her do these tests, and she couldn't do them because she was having problems breathing. Well, it turned out one of her tumors was on her bronchial tube. This other doctor who came in later did that and explained that. And yeah, it was just it. And my last conversation with my mother was the weekend that she passed away. She had gone out of the hospital on Friday after she had to stay for 2 nights to keep monitor. Dan had came up. We were getting ready for her consultations on Monday. She had gone out. On Sunday, my one cousin had a birthday party. She was there. She got to see. It was a good last day for her. She got to see most of her nephews and nieces and most of her siblings. When the party was over, Dan and I took her back to the house. We were going to stay there that night. So Dan's family has a summer trailer about 30 minutes north of where my community is. So it was kind of funny when we met each other and we learned that, he had summers near where I was from, and we had never really ran into each other. I wouldn't be surprised as a local if I did run into him or him and his family. Probably rolled my eyes at how the Toronto people were invading our area, but that's another story.
I know that feeling as a Sylvan Laker in Alberta.
There's pictures taken that day. I can't look at the pictures because she's lost her color. You could see the color was lost. I took her into the house. She needed help getting into the house. She was late. She had been sleeping in her recliner for a couple of weeks before she got diagnosed because that was easier for her to sleep. I remember wrapping her in a blanket because she was cold. I went back with Dan to his family's trailer to get her luggage because we had forgotten to bring it with us that morning. We were staying with her that night because we were taking her into the consultation the next day. And she had texted me that she couldn't breathe. And she couldn't get a hold of my sister. So I called my sister. My sister rushed down there. We had just finally established, maybe I think a year before that, we had finally built a firehouse in the community. It had been something we had been trying to do for about 25 years, because when people call first response, I'm not saying it's the first responders' fault, but we had some first responders in our house, but in our community, but the location was further away. And for the longest time, if there was a fire in the community, or if there was a heart attack or a stroke, the house would be gone. The person would not survive. So we had, luckily, the first responders were a minute walk away from her house. So it's not on them. It was her time to finally go, based on the way things ended up falling into place. But they got there. They tried. They couldn't revive her. She had collapsed she collapsed into my sister's arm. She had collapsed into my sister's arm, and we haven't followed up with it to find out. We're not very impressed with it, but I would love to see a comparative analysis done with non-Native people in my region going to the hospital, and what the success rate is for cancer and why it's so low to non-existent for my community. Again, not saying all doctors and nurses in my region are bad. I know people who I went to high school with some of these people. I went to elementary school with some of these nurses. They're good people. They're good people, and they're not the ones calling the shots half the time.
I know, but it's the barrier is so clear.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Again, it's that whole thing. Like I said, we're Cowies, so they know where we're from.
Yeah.
Dan's mother was diagnosed with the same cancer in August of 2016, and she had just passed away in March of 2019. Yes. So we were fortunate. We got to keep making memories with her and making a count with her for almost a full 3 years after her diagnosis. My mom got 11 days. A veteran, someone who had done peacekeeping, she was a military police officer. She was part of the security detail for the Montreal Olympics in '76. She had went over with other peacekeepers to go help with the South Vietnamese who were fleeing. They were called Boat people. That's not politically correct anymore, but the South Vietnamese who had fled, she helped with bringing them back to Canada. She'd gone 6 months over to Egypt and Israel with the Camp David Accords in '86. She retired in '91 because of the cuts that were done by Mulroney, but there was a point of period where she almost went to the Gulf War, but obviously she was a single parent, so they didn't let single parents go. She served for 17 years and then went on to serve the community. She went back to school. She got her undergrad. She got her teaching degree. She taught as much as she could, but because she was an older person, it was harder for her to get a permanent position. So she eventually gave up and started working back in the community. But she was still an educator. She was still like an auntie to many people, whether they were blood related or not in our community. That's our customs. Never bragged about it. My first Christmas she had missed because she was part of a search and rescue team in northern Quebec looking for a plane that had crashed. So for that to happen, and I'm not just saying that because it's my mother, and I know there's similar stories, that this story is not the only one. You have Brian Sinclair, who died waiting in the Emerge area of a hospital in Winnipeg because it was thought that he was just, an alcoholic and drunk. You have these cases across the country because there is systematic racism within the healthcare system, not just the healthcare system, but the legal system, the justice system, or that's both of them, the police system. Yep. It's in the academic system.
Yep.
I literally had someone on my when I was doing my I told you probably about this because I bring it up all the time. My Canadian comprehensive. So when you're doing a PhD, and again, I want to say that there's many good people at the University of Alberta in the department of my choice. My advisor is amazing. The teachers that I had during that time, I absolutely love. I've learned so much from a lot of the people. There are select people though, who really need to go and take a course to understand that just because you may be a woman does not mean you can speak for all women, or that just because you're a woman does not mean you share the same experiences as Native people or Black people. Mm-hmm. At my university, you go and do 2 comprehensive exams. So you have your coursework your first year. The second year is you do comprehensive exams. So it depends on the university. So at University of Alberta, you do 2 papers, 1 in each of your fields. So my subfields were Canadian and comparative because Indigenous politics does not yet exist as a subfield. So I'm really in Canadian comparative and Indigenous. So that's what I tell everyone. And that's what I list on my own bio, because that is what I do. I do a lot of stuff between Indigenous and Canadian relations and history and political relations, but I also do a lot with Australia and New Zealand. So I do a lot between Indigenous people and British colonial structures is pretty much what I'll say. So you do one for each of your fields, and you have to do 10,000 words per each. Minimum, like that's maximum you're supposed to do. So many people have handed in their comprehensive exams, been double that. Someone in my cohort who is a good friend, nothing against him, was over his limit. I got in trouble for being over my limits. My Canadian comp, because I was talking about bringing indigeneity into Canadian political science, it was double the words almost. It was about, I think the first round I did was about 18,000, but that's because I'm pretty much meshing Indigenous studies with political science. So you have no choice. My comparative politics was talking about how we need to have a discussion about sovereignty, and that sovereignty in the Western construct does not necessarily equate the same for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that we need to have a discussion in a comparative sense on what sovereignty means for other people. So I was told my comparative comp was an issue because sovereignty is an IR thing. Yeah, but comparative is about everything, you know. Like if someone had told me a long time ago not to do comparative because it will talk about everything, you have to do everything in it, I would have listened, because yeah. So anyone who's listening wants to do political science, avoid comparative, because you'll be talking about all the things. I had someone say my Canadian comp was a conspiracy theory, because I talked about bringing indigeneity into the field. Yeah, so I failed my first round. This wasn't my mentors. My mentors were amazing. I give kudos to them for working with me and trying, but it was also other people. There is various reasons for issues over that. I had one person who seemed not to be very impressed that I did not include any of their information or any of their research in it. This person was looked at as the Canadianist Indigenous person to an extent over this topic as well. They're Indigenous, but they're Indigenous to another region of the Americas. The experience in different parts of the Americas in relation to colonialism is different depending on which nation and which European power they had to build relationships with, or who pretty much tried to murder them all. It depends. I think for someone who has an understanding on the Indigenous Canadian relationship, it's important to have someone who actually gets it from within, because they're a part of it. I grew up understanding that colonization is the issue for what has been done to First Nation women. I do see a need for Indigenous feminism. I get it. I never grew up learning about it because I only learned from women. My mom, my aunt, my elders were all female. My language instructor was female. So learning from them, it was decolonization is how we get rid of the patriarchy, because colonialism is what created the patriarchy for a lot of Indigenous nations. Métis might be a different story again, because parts of European constructs come into how their nation is formed. But I got reprimanded for that. But I know other people who've been able to say, well, that's not a part of my culture. Feminism is not a part of my culture. So they were passed. Or people who, had double the word count. I know someone who had a few years before me had more than double the word count for one comp. They passed just fine. So I got accosted for having too many words, for being above the limit. And I got accosted because sovereignty is an IR thing. It doesn't get discussed in comparative. And they wanted me to change my topic originally on Canadian. And I told them no. I'm like, I will not change my topic. I will rewrite it. I'm like, but I will not change my topic from being about indigeneity in the field of Canadian politics. I'm like, that's why I came there. That's why I went out to U of A. When I got brought in as a student, it was the person who was in charge of the graduate the graduate program at there for my field. She had a lot of intersections herself. She's amazing. If anyone's listening, they want to read up stuff about some really good stuff, look up Melinda Smith. She is amazing. For Canadian, look up Janine Brody, look up Linda Trimble. For identity politics, look up Yasmin Abu-Labin. Amazing people I had a chance to learn from and who have influenced me in so many ways. European politics, Lori Thorlaxon, great people to learn from. There are many people in that department who are good to learn from. But the issue I ended up having was that during this process, when I failed, this is what I had. I had heard, like, again, I heard someone say my Canadian was conspiracy theory. I was shocked by that. This is someone who does health policy. So why they were in charge of my Canadian side, I don't know, because they mainly do health policy. But on top of that, when I talked to the new graduate chair at the time, because she had the person who was there when I got brought in as a student was no longer the graduate chair, it was someone else. They knew in my department I dealt with anxiety and depression. And so my anxiety gets really up, especially when I'm freaking out. And the comprehensive exams are a really powerful thing to go through. They are, I wouldn't wish it upon my enemy. It's a difficult, stressful thing to go through because
I definitely wish it on Stephen Harper then.
I don't know. I might have sympathy because I've gone through it. So I might be like, this is how I get.
He deserves none.
But this person, she was the graduate chair. She was clearly upper class British, you could tell. Had a lot of degrees from very prestigious British schools. Proceeded to tell me that, it only gets harder from here. And so and that I potentially should consider, rethinking what my future is. But then also proceeded to tell me, well, as a woman, I know what it means, what it's like to face, what's the term?
Oppression?
Not oppression, it's a different term. I can't remember. I don't know why I can't think of it, but I know what it's like to have barriers in my way or something like that. And I'm like looking at her and I'm looking at her Oxford and other degrees and then looking at her again as she just told me that, it only gets harder from here. And, other people who've dealt with forms of identity politics have faced issues when this person, and this is just my own perspective, so I can't say it's true. I just, from what I've seen and from what I've heard from other students who are from specific backgrounds who were hired or who were brought in as students prior to this person having become chair, she's no longer the chair, which I'm thankful for. And it just so happened, like during that period as well, I didn't get any scholarships. I did not get awarded anything until after they were gone. But it wasn't just me who started that. It seemed to be a lot of those who dealt with what would be defined as identity politics faced a murky period while that person was in charge of the department. And
yeah, but that's tens of thousands of dollars for you. And that, like, that's the whole thing. Like, I don't understand how people can't see how almost impossible it is for Indigenous people to succeed.
Well, after my first year, I had to come and ask them about work. I had to ask them for work because it was assumed that I was getting funding from my community. I don't get funding from my community. So it was assumed that I was going to be okay. And I had to be like, no, I need work. I'm like, I have no funding. There was an assumption there that was quickly corrected, but I know that happens with a lot of students. But the amount of pushback some people have because they think their way of doing political science is the only way it should be done is problematic. Again, luckily, they eventually were no longer grad chair. My advisor and other good people, currently the person in charge of the grad program and who's generally in charge of the department, they're all good people. They're great. Like, so I can't say anything negative. And it was just that period of time there that was hard to deal with. When I had to redefend, because so if you fail your comms the first time, you have to you can rewrite them and then go again. And if you fail the second time, you have to withdraw from the program. So you get two chances. I was the first one. so what had happened, the cohort before me, half of them failed out. Half of them failed their comprehensive exams. They rewrote them, tried to pass the second time. They failed them. My cohort, I was the second of my cohorts to go. The person before me got a conditional pass. I failed. I was the only person who failed and then passed the second time, out of, I think, 4 people before me. So that's what my cohort had going in, the fact that 4 people failed and then failed out because they failed the second time. 4-3. I can't remember. It's 4-3, but it was traumatic, and dealing with depression, anxiety. Like, I had to freak out because a good friend of mine was someone who had failed out just before my defense. So I had an anxiety attack, and I went and talked to this department chair, or this graduate chair, and it was just saying, like, I was freaking out because of it. And that's why they mentioned later on, after I'd failed, that, maybe it's only going to get harder from here, so maybe you should consider your options. And it's like, I came to you in trust and confidence because I was having an anxiety attack, not because I was weak. And I came along and passed it a second time. Like, I passed it the second time, so I was very happy. I was very stubborn. Now it's just getting the dissertation done.
Yeah. Well,
I
can't wait to call you Dr. Cowie.
Thank you. My enemies, I will force to call me that, but no. But like, my story is not dissimilar to others that I heard of. There is a lot of things that get pushed back, and like, my advisor, my MA advisor, amazing person. I'm so thankful I got a chance to learn from her. Again, if you are interested in political science or political stuff, Indigenous politics, Kiara Ladner, look her up. Her articles, her stuff is amazing. She does a lot of stuff on constitutionalism, treaty federalism in the past. I'm so thankful I got to learn from her for my master's degree, and that she still influences me today. I'm glad to be able to call her as someone who taught me a lot. She also taught my aunt and my mom when they were at Trent as mature students. Yeah. She taught my aunt at Trent, but she sat on the board with my mother. So when I met Kira, it was in my undergrad. She was originally teaching at Western, and she was teaching my Intro to Canadian Politics class. And I went to introduce her. I went to introduce myself, and I said my last name. She said, Cowie, is your mother Georgina? I'm like, that's my aunt. And she's like, so your mother's Beverly? And I'm like, yes. How do you know this? And so when she originally finished all of her education, she had went and taught at Trent. And so she had taught my aunt a class, and she sat on a board with my mom. So, and she's the one who convinced me to go back after I finished my undergrad, because I had a hard time when I finished undergrad. It was difficult. I had gone through a really bad depression during my last year when I worked for a year for that organization that represents 133 of the communities in Ontario. And she's the one who convinced me to go back and to up my GPA to be able to go back to school. So I have to acknowledge I am where I am today because Kiera pushed me to go back and told me that, no, you need to go back and get your grades higher and then come out here and do a master's with me. And I'm so thankful for that.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's so kind. I think of when I graduated high school in '94, and like there was nobody to go talk to about these things. I'm so grateful you had somebody in your life that just understood and helped you through. Well, helped encourage you. I mean, you did that work, and rightfully so. You deserve every accolade for it. So I don't know. And then on top of it, like, you were really embedded in the Liberal Party, and that's a lot of extracurricular work on top of what you're doing. Like, it's such a, I don't know how you did it. Like, I mean, I'm taking stock of the amount of hours I open emails, I close emails, respond to emails, respond to this, respond to that, make reports, and it's like, I don't have full-time school. So I can't imagine.
If you remember my last year on the IPC executive as co-chair, it was last year. So the fall, I got married. I was working full-time as a recruiter, so I was on the road that entire fall. I was working on my proposal for my dissertation, and then I was doing the IPC stuff, which is a full-time job. You know it is. Like,
yes.
There's a lot. So I was doing 4 things that were taking up everything, plus, trying to make sure I did not lose my spouse during that time because of because of a reckless abandonment or not not having time, but he understood that I was very actively involved. So that was how my fall was. And so I was also, and like, you know, I got married, so I was planning my wedding. So got married in November, and, you know, I was like, cool, but I decided to teach that. That was the winter was my first semester teaching at McGill. So I also taught. So I replaced wedding planning with a class. So during the fall, right up until convention in Halifax, I was teaching, because I brought a whole bunch of essays with me, if you remember, from my like final papers for my class. And I went off to a Starbucks, because I went and did my parts. I said I would do what I had to do, and then I had to go mark. And I sadly met some poor first year PhD student who was all excited. And I'm like, well, you'll be emptied like I am on the inside soon. But it came out by accident. So it was your, but like I was doing that, plus getting ready for convention, making sure everything was in order, making sure policy was ready, making sure, you know, the executive was strong, making sure our constitution was strong, because that was also the period of time when we had, when with Rhonda Evans, our membership and organization person during that executive, had to rewrite our, what was it called? What's it called now? It's not the Constitution. It's our section of Constitution, but what's it called?
Charter.
Yeah, we had to write our charter. So these are the basic things, our bylaws that we would follow. And that was a whole other thing, because when I asked Rhonda to run, I was like, oh, you know, you just have to keep track of everyone, make sure they have their elections. And then this happened. I'm like, so yeah.
So Rhonda, I know she's so great though. I don't know. Yeah.
But like there was all that during that entire year too. And then, yeah, it was a busy period, but I loved it. I'm about 60, 70 pounds lighter than I was during that period, because
it was so stressful. I can't. So, and in Alberta here, like we have constitutional lawyers that just absolutely were ripping apart the whole idea. And it was actually Albertans that were really against the new constitution and the new charter changes. And, you know, it was such an isolating experience, because, I mean, Justin Trudeau actually stood up and talked about being in favor of the Constitution. And it's like, that's not fair. You're the Prime Minister. That's not fair. So yeah, and Alberta kind of stayed in our seats and just shut up. And
well, it's hard, right? Like, because that's also part of the party mentality. You know, you have to put on the red colored glasses and drink the Kool-Aid. You can't speak up because the leader is good. The leader is great. The president is good. The president is great. No, she would not. Again,
you know, like, what's funny? I can tell you, Chad, like, even for me, I mean, I've been, you know, trying to help this party for how many years? And, you know, at first they'll follow me, be friends with me. And then over the course of time, it's like, oh, somewhere along the lines, I've been unfriended or unfollowed. And, you know, whether it's them themselves or maybe a staffer, I don't know. But either or, it's so painfully clear, like, here it is now after all of this conversation about gaslighting and, you know, us trying to tell them a million things. I feel like, oh, maybe now that they're starting to understand. I mean, they will never eat crow and say sorry to you or to me, but there'll be somebody new that's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you know, that's who they'll hook into. But ultimately, like, it's just some of us just kind of get pushed to the side for sure.
That's how it works, so right? You know, like there's bushy tails. Like, I came in like that. Well, why didn't we try this? Russ Diabo back in the early 90s would have been that example. He was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. There's a reason why he is obviously not involved anymore and why he's being very critical. I understand it. I just did not like when he called my entire executive, my first term, children, because we were young. I was 8 going on to being 18, 20 when I was a kid because of half the stuff that I had to go through. So, yeah, I may have been young, but I have understanding too. I have book smarts, but I also have street smarts. I know where I come from. And I also have a foot in both canoes, but that is the case. It's always new people come up who have the energy, right? So I was clearly burning on whatever fumes were left in my tank by the time I was done. And the agreement was, because I wanted to make sure the rest of you did not suffer because of my standings, was to fall on the sword. So that way, those of you who are still there could continue on and not be looked at negatively because of being associated with me. And there's many of you guys in the IPC still who are doing great work. I'm glad you guys can continue it. I'm still sitting on the side on, you know, a chair with popcorn watching whatever slow motion situations going on, but I totally support the IPC for what they're doing. They're there to try to do good things. There are always some people who get involved who are Indigenous, who are there for their own self-meaning. We know a couple. And there are many who get involved, though, to do what is right, to make things better for their community. So they are working from the inside trying to change it. The people on the inside who are actually trying to change it are just as important as the people out on the streets pushing from the outside. Both have to work together in some way. I'm not saying that they have to agree with each other, but some of the push that can be done on the inside comes from the education that yourself, myself, and other people have been doing on the inside. And when they see the push from the outside, it can be like, see, now you need to keep listening. So that helps with getting some understanding. Does it always work? No. Am I having, reconsideration about being able to always push from the inside? Yes. But that's me. I did my time, and I think I'm now more part of that generation who's there to help give the tools to the next generation to dismantle the master's house, to blow up the master's house to an extent. No way does that mean that I'm actually referring to blowing anything up. That's a figure of speech. So,
Yeah.
I end up having myself wiretapped.
Yeah, I know. It's a really weird world we live in now, where we have to clarify and some things that I'm prior to 9/11, I used to in Sylvan Lake, people called the tourists terrorists. And of course, after 9/11, probably not very socially or politically correct in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, I get it. I hate it, because we're already over policed and over monitored and such, and people try to take what we say out of context. I hate it. So anyway, I just hope I so appreciate you sharing everything that you shared, and I'm so glad you finally got to be on my podcast. It's one of those things I want to have you and Naomi, and we were so close with Naomi, but then we had a whole thing happen, and it was so sad, because she just got her bar where you go to the bar and they allow you to be a lawyer in Alberta. So I don't know.
Her Alberta Bar Association, she has Ontario and Alberta. Yeah, that's another person. If anyone's listening, you really want to learn from a very strong person who, oh my God, her writing. She has tons of writing notes. She has a blog.
Yeah, and she's a lawyer.
Can I? Like her name being said? I'm assuming because she has her law firm. But Naomi Sayers, if you look her up in. Put her name, you'll have so many amazing things to read and look at. She gives you a lot of things to consider. And I know I've learned a lot from her, just as I've learned from you, Michelle. And many people I've learned from being politically involved and through my own education pursuits. It's not just academics, teachers who taught me. I've learned a lot from friends. And Naomi is someone I've learned a lot from as well, just as I've learned from you. To be able to have conversations and know that we're just having conversations and being able to talk and support each other, whether or not we have the same opinion on something. I still remember us talking about Site C and having to go between, telling the party off versus, just not saying anything. And we had to come to that middle. I remember that middle ground piece that we wrote was contentious issue for the communications for the party.
Yeah, I know.
That was the thing we took. We said we supported UNDRIP and we supported proper consultation. That's all we said.
It's a crazy thing. I always thought we were helping and trying to give that Indigenous perspective. And the irony is that they just sometimes don't want to hear it at all. And I hope now in this post, I don't know what to say anymore. I mean, we were going to have Chief Adam at our IPC fundraiser, the weekend after everything got shut down from COVID-19. And, I just don't know what to really expect anymore, but we're doing some town hall call-ins, and it's kind of sucks because I still haven't met this Seamus O'Regan, and he has a town hall, so I sent in a question, but yeah, I just don't even know him. I've never met him, nothing. And I'm from Alberta, I'm Indigenous, we should have a relationship. Whatever.
Well, it's hard, right? I think Mark Miller's doing a good job. It's hard, but we need to also remember he took initiative to learn stuff about Indigenous people from his own region that he's from. He started looking at Mohawk. He started understanding more stuff in that region long before he became a minister. He has some really great people working for him who get it. I was very happy with how some of the approaches were that he did take during the blockades over Wet'suwet'en, and how he's responded about RCMP issues in regards to how we're treated as Indigenous people. It's unfortunate that people are shocked by it because this has been an ongoing issue. We got to remember the RCMP was formed as the Northwest Mounted Police, they were formed to tame the West, and that taming also meant dealing with us and the prairie nations that existed out there. That's what
I share on Twitter and Facebook. Like, he's not following me, clearly. We should have a relationship. We don't. And it's just one of those things. It's like, if this is a shock to you, then you need to do better. You need to be paying attention, because, I mean, it's not just me. I mean, just follow, I don't know, one of the CBC Indigenous reporters. Just follow one of them. Don't follow me, follow one of them and see. This should not shock you.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, some of the things that even Indigenous journalists go through, what they have to read and see. Like, two of my favorite ones to follow. One is I'll never get her first name right. She's Mohawk. She's from Ganawagi. Calistio Deer. My last name Deer. I love following her. I have her on social media, and I follow a lot of her stories. But also Rhiannon Johnson, who's from my community. She also worked for CBC Indigenous. And I was recently quoted a thing about voting from her. But both of them, I enjoy reading their stuff because I have connection with them. One's from the territory. I know a sibling of one of them, and then the other one I grew up with. I still remember when she started kindergarten. So.
There you go. Angela Sterrett, she's the one I follow the most, I think, because she she's actually from the Wet'suwet'en territory, so she was the one who taught us how to say Wet'suwet'en, Yenke, Unastoden, Gidamanden, and Delamuk. Like, she was the one who taught us that. She put out that video. I don't know. I really love having her there, but I don't know what more to say. There's some politicians that have the audacity to say, I'm surprised, when you yourself seeing the policies that I put forward from, RCMP spying and treating Indigenous poorly and not wanting that. And, I don't know if they just didn't read the policies. I don't know.
Policies, but report after report, inquiry, commission, from Hawthorne all the way up to even the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, the same things have been said. You can look back to the early 1900s reports on residential schools and about taking children away from their communities and it being not lauded. You could see issues about housing and infrastructure in communities. You can see these reports, they go back. There'll be another report in 10 years that's going to say the same thing that parts of RCAP, the TRC, that Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry said, things that were said in the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing, things that were said back in the 80s during the mega constitutional discussions. These are always said. So it's hard when you hear, well, believe this. Some of the select politicians that are still in Parliament were there the day RCAP was introduced into Parliament. And what happened to that? We just finally, a couple of years ago, had Indian Affairs divided into, well, it was called Indigenous Affairs, which was a good change, but Indigenous Affairs was finally divided into two different ministries. This was suggested by RCAP.
In 1996.
Yes, which only happened in 2017? Was it my first year teaching? Yeah, it was, because it was weird that it happened, because we were talking about it in my class, and it was a big change. Yeah, because my first year was Colton Boushie, the acquittal, but also the changing of the ministries into two different ministries, or changing the ministry to two different ministries. The second one was, my second year teaching was when everything happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould. And always happens when I'm talking about westward expansion and further paternalism, when I'm talking about the number treaties and how the clearing of the plains. But always these big issues nationally happened right during that time. And then that happened again. Wet'suwet'en was right, like, when everything went up in the air and went bad because Canada decided to do its national interest argument. It happened right during that same period of time when I was talking about westward expansion and further paternalism, when we talked about the Indian Act and opening the prairies to European settlement. But I had to talk with the students about what that means, national interest, which comes from these court cases one which you've already mentioned, where it's the idea that Canada has a right to infringe on Indigenous rights, First Nation rights specifically, when it is in the national interest of the country. The national interest of Canadians can therefore override Indigenous rights. But it's funny how it can override Indigenous rights in places where there's no treaty, such as Wet'suwet'en, or how do you say it? Because I never learned how to say it properly, so I just realized I was doing it wrong.
Not really. So it's Wet'suwet'en. So you've got it. So you just say it quick, and that's okay.
Yeah. I say it quick. I just say it wrong. So. But it's interesting that they can argue that. And as soon as, because I remember in early January when the Prime Minister of Canada started using the term national interest to describe the area, I told my students, I'm like, watch, this is what they're going to argue. And that's what they argued. That's when they can override it. But it never goes well when they do it that way, because it still infringes on Indigenous rights, especially when there was two different opportunities for a different way for the pipeline to go through. Arguments about the fact that there's no treaty, so it's not ceded, and therefore it's still Wet'suwet'en title. But just how people responded to that shows you just the issues here. And so I've always hated when people talked about the United States and, Canada's like that apartment above like a drug den or above a gang den. And it's like, no, Canada is the second floor to a 2-story house. You just aren't paying attention and seeing it. And so when people have been angry, again, as I said earlier, have been angry over what's happened down in the States, that's good. It's good to be angry. I'm glad to see these statues of Confederates and slaveholders and Columbus get tossed in. I would love to see the statue of John A. Macdonald here in Montreal get thrown into the St. Lawrence, put him back where he should be and should have stayed. In the water. But
yep.
Where was that anger when Canadians were threatening to drive through Native people because we weren't worth anything? Where was the anger from people who would have heard about the 2 women charged for promoting Shoot a Savage Day? Where was the anger over the man who promoted napalming our communities? And where was the anger recently over a man who was charged for threatening to go and spread COVID amongst Indigenous people so that way we'd go away?
Yeah. Did you know that I'm still collecting community statements over that, because they have a really strong case, but it's really important that people of prominence, write the police and tell them how it affected them, so that way we have an even stronger case, right?
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, because that was right here, and I hate it. It's so embarrassing when we make national news for all the wrong reasons, but then at the same time, we make national news for all the wrong reasons, and yet people are like, oh, what do you mean? There's racism? So that whole gaslighting has been really hard for me this week, and I don't know if getting over it's the right word, but I'm starting to at least make peace with it a bit, where it's like, okay, so this is all fucking new to you, and you all just didn't read the TRC or the inquiry, and you've only had the TRC for 5 years, you've only had the inquiry free for a year, you've only had the RCAP available since 1996. Ooh, this is all a shock to you. Shut up. Just shut. Honestly, I having a really hard time with some of the stupid comments that come from people, and then the silence from people that you would think would be the strongest advocates or whichever to say about it. But it doesn't matter. We are where we are, and you've been working really hard at trying to change this narrative for decades now, so you just keep going.
It's hard how to, when you bring in Indigenous sovereignty, when you bring in nationhood, you bring in the unilateral imposition by Canada, it calls into question the legitimacy of the Canadian state. People are afraid of that. But not only does it call into question the legitimacy of the state, but it calls into question the Canadian identity. As we know, having identity called into question and judged is a hard thing to go through. And when people are taught a certain narrative that has been very much implemented for 50 years in our education system about what a Canadian is, it's hard. But I see progress in during my master's program, during my master's degree, when I was doing coursework, I had to read a piece that talked about settlers. It was the first time I heard Canadians referred to that way in an academic piece. I was one of 7 people in the class. The other 6 were non-natives. They were all angry. They were not happy to be called settlers because they were Canadian. That was their identity. My first year teaching, we had an open discussion about settler identity and what that meant. And again, just what we talked about earlier in the session, But it was an open discussion. I had to tell them. And again, that was the same thing last year and the same thing this year. That open discussion was able to happen. And I've told each year that I've taught the class, I'm like, in my master's program, when I heard this term, this could not be talked about openly without people being all up in arms. I'm like, to hear you guys being in the discussion was amazing to me. And so like, I would tell my students that because that shows me progress. So there's change coming.
Okay, but I have to tell you this story then. I have to.
Okay.
During the height of Idle No More, so this would have been 2012-ish, Ezra Levant came to Calgary because he was going to go after David Suzuki. And, I'm sitting there in my outfits and whatever. I wasn't even dressed traditionally. I think I was dressed in like a suit type outfit, right? Like that's what I think I was wearing. And Ezra Levant put a, mic in my mouth and said something or other. And I said something about settlers. And he said, that's really offensive to me. And I laughed at him and I said, well, sir, I know that you've been in Toronto for a super long time, but just down the road over there is the Settler Pioneer Society, where they proudly call themselves settlers. So I was actually born and raised here, and I'm quite used to people proudly talking about their settler roots as pioneers. So you might want to double check your Eastern status there, buddy. And he never aired that, of course, but he got so angry, and him and his crew just like took off away from me. And then I did watch, he kind of covered it a little bit, and he basically questioned my indigeneity. And he was like, well, it was just this beautiful woman with green eyes. She wouldn't tell me her name, but, and just kind of downplayed me. But it was kind of a favorite moment because here in Alberta, saying the term settler is quite normalized. But for poor Toronto Easterners, they are so offended with their settler fragility.
Southern Ontarians, Northern Ontarians to an extent, Quebecers, Maritimers, very much offended by the term, because their families came over, in the 1600s. My favorite comment is from my friend Megan. Her family can be connected to the Mayflower. And one of her ancestors named Love, I don't remember her last name, but it was Love something. And so we had a good joke about that, but got kidnapped by Native people. And I was just like, you probably stole food. And she's like, yeah, I guarantee you my ancestors deserved it. So she's woke. So she's like, yeah. She's like, yeah, I already know that probably is what, she probably definitely deserved it. So it's funny to have those kind of talks, but it's interesting how people can't comprehend. And that's where the term settler is an issue. If you can, if I can quickly go up and get my notes from I did a presentation, a talk to at the University of Regina. I did a guest lecture there last Sunday for a class, but I did a definition of settler colonial, and I'm going to share that, and then I'll be done and I'll shut up.
As if. I love talking with you.
But it's an important definition that people need to remember, that this is the difference between colonial and why it's important to remember that Canada is a settler colonial state. My office is full of different... Oh, sorry, 1 second. Am I still there?
Yep, I see you.
Sorry, I did something. I touched a button. I'm so no longer technologically inclined. My office is full of stuff right now because I've been doing work on my dissertation and reading articles. But so I did a discussion on Indigenous methodologies and research, and how to incorporate more Indigenous understanding, so that way we're learning instead of making assumptions, because that's been a problem with quantitative and qualitative methods. And how we do research is that it sometimes leaves out the actual way Indigenous people need to be taught, and that there's more that has to go alongside than just treating it like it's a research, while also remembering Western academia and Western research is biased because it's based in Western understanding. This was all used as a way to undermine different groups of people, including Indigenous people, from contact on, especially after the Enlightenment period. But what we need to remember as well is what settler colonialism is. And Canadians need to understand that this is Canada and this is part of their identity. And when you're agreeing to Canada, when you're accepting that you're Canadian, you need to also remember that this is part of Canada and part of being Canadian, and that in order to reconcile, you have to understand this in order to be able to bring reconciliation in general. So, settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of Indigenous peoples with a settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and concept of their sovereignty. Settler colonialism can be distinguished from other forms of colonialism in the following ways. Settler colonizers come to stay. Settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event. Settler colonialism seeks its own end. Unlike other types of colonialism in which the goal is to maintain colonial structures and imbalances in power between colonizer and colonized, settler colonization trends towards the ending of colonial difference in the form of a supreme and unchallenged settler state and people. This is where we get absorbed. That is why the Indian Act is the way it is, why we eventually will be filtered out. Because when there is no longer Native people in a community, who gets that land? It goes back to Crown land. My community will be extinct by the end of the century if we go by this understanding. And this is important to remember when actually approaching all this stuff, because it has that impact. And this is important to remember, that this is not just about colonialism. It's not the same as in Africa. It's not the same as in parts of Asia. It's not the same as in some of the island nations in the Pacific. Canada is here, and they're establishing that they're here to stay, and trying to absorb us in and treat us like we are once, calling us Canada's Aboriginals, Canada's Natives, furthers that narrative and reminds us that no matter what we try to do, they're still trying to make sure that we only identify as this way. I look at myself as a dual citizen, as I've told you. I'm an Anishinaabe citizen as well as a citizen of Canada, because I'm acknowledging my Canadian roots, but specifically my Irish background, but their connections to that background in honor of my grandmother, but also my Anishinaabe, my Mississauga roots through my grandfather and through my mother. And my job is to make sure that my nation does not disappear, but is acknowledged and recognized. If my nation decides to federate with the Canadian state at one time in the future, that's another thing. That's a whole other thing. And by nation, I don't mean my community. I'm a Mississauga person. There are 6 communities that are Mississauga. Sorry, sometimes I'm still learning some stuff about my Mississauga roots, because it's only been the last couple of years where the Mississauga communities have been coming together for the first time in 200 years. Yeah. But we are a nation. If we decide to federate with Canada, that's a whole other thing. But if we don't, like some other groups of some other nations would prefer not to, or confederacies like the Haudenosaunee will never probably confederate with Canada. It just needs to be expected or accepted. As long as we keep remembering that, as long as Canadians start to learn that, that's how we start to deconstruct settler colonialism. It's also how we start to deconstruct colonialism in general, and what I would term as legislative genocide towards First Nations people.
Oh, 100%. And I think they've said that basically in RCAP and TRC as well. And then I know they said it in the National Inquiry, because they talked about how when they created the Indian Act and the gender, the sexism within the Indian Act, how that absolutely was part of the genocide that are the women and those identify as Two-Spirit are facing. So, I don't think that's even debatable. I think it's fact. So,
which is what needs to be reminded to Canadians and needs to be understood, and that Canadians need to understand this is not necessarily an attack on their identity. This is an identity part. This is a part of their history that needs to be reconciled, not forgotten, not pretended like it's in the past, because as I've said many times, it's nice to pretend like it's in the past. It's nice to say, we must look forward when you're from the dominant group who's not been impacted negatively. You can't move forward unless you acknowledge and take ownership of the past, especially when the past is not just created by one person.
Chad, seriously, this second, right now, we've had more police killing of Indigenous people in New Brunswick than COVID-19 today. And that's what people are putting out on Twitter and Facebook. And it's true. So, for anyone to say it was in the past, they can just eat me. Anyway, Chad, I know you and I could talk forever, and you are welcome on my podcast anytime. We can do one tomorrow, or we can do one 2 years from now. Just know that I don't just consider you like a colleague. You are one of my dearest, closest friends, and I am so grateful, because you're one of the only people that understand the world the way I understand the world, and I don't have to explain myself. And I get so exhausted with the white coding, and then you and I both know when we have to white code together in order to try to make any positive change. So I just so grateful that you're in my world, in my life, and we've gone on this journey together, and I just can't thank you enough for being on my podcast too.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And obviously, I look at you more than a colleague, and you're definitely a very close friend. You wouldn't have gotten an invite to the wedding if that was not the case.
Oh my God, I wish I could go on and on about how nice your wedding was too. So crazy to talk about, literally where Hogwarts is.
Well, that's whole thing. I do the work that I do because I want things better for the next generation. I have been fortunate enough. I benefited from. I can only imagine what my mother went through as an Indigenous woman who was in the military in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. I can only imagine what my partner's mother went through during the exact same period of time in social work and trying to establish like what people of certain backgrounds or what women had to go through to be able to have the say that they do. And of course, it's still not equal, still not right, but I know I am where I am because of the people I've learned from, including people like yourself, people like my mom, people like my mother-in-law. Even for the 10 years I got to know my mother-in-law. But I am who I am, and I've learned from what I have based on the fact of what I've learned. And I try to remind myself that I can't let myself be stuck in one rut, one mindset. I'm pretty sure some things that I think now that my 18-year-old self or my 22-year-old self would be like, what the fuck?
Oh my gosh. Seriously, Chad, I feel you so hard on that. Oh, well, even my 30-year-old self, like, so I don't know if you watched Dave Chappelle's newest outtake here, 15 minutes, but I did. And I've done enough anti-racism work that what he said to me is not at all slightly offensive. It's not the opposite. Like I had so much empathy of an understanding of everything he said. But 10 years ago, I would have been like, that guy's racist. I can't listen to this. Yep. So like even 10 years ago, Michelle, to today, Michelle is such a different person. And I'm just grateful to have you and so many people along my journey with me. So I just hope you know it.
The other part of being in a state that's still colonial and being in a settler colonial society is that our own people, us, each individual is still, we have decolonization to do within ourselves too.
Yes, 100%.
And again, my 18-year-old self wanted nothing to do with my Indigenous background, even though I grew up in my community, because of the stereotypes and the stigma towards it. It was listening to an elderly woman, an elder from Stony Point. Her family was originally from Stony Point. This is what led to the Upper Wash standoff and the murder of Dudley George. She was a little girl when they came in and evicted her community from their land. And her story made me rethink stuff. So it was an aha moment. I wish she was still on this earth so I could thank her for how it opened my mind. But at one time I told my mom that when I had kids, they were not to know that they were Native. She was not to tell them. And if she told them, I would cut off contact. She would never see them again. I told her that this is my early teenage years.
Yeah.
My 14-year-old, my 14-year-old would look at me and be like, huh. But you know.
Yeah. No, I was an asshole when I was 14. I was embarrassed of my Native mom and our visits and was happy to disown her when we could. And I'm such an asshole when I think about what I was like then. But it was that parental alienation, and it was that bigger picture of Canada telling me to never be proud of to be Native. So like I even have already forgiven myself, and I always ask my mom, and you know, she's a strong Catholic, so she's like, oh, of course I forgive you. But thank God she's so forgiving. Yeah.
Good for that. But that is a big part. We Canadians forget, white and non-white Canadians forget that the pressure on us to reject who we are and who and what we come from is still so strong. And, you know, unless it's for a picture or a photo op, then, you know, oh, cool, look at that. But when we speak up, it's like, nope, be quiet. But the pressure to still reject what we come from and reject the history that exists and the contemporary actions that exist is still so strong. Again, changes are happening, and I just hope for future generations, like your daughter's generation, my nephews and niece generation, and hopefully my kids' generation, my grandchildren's generation, if I'm lucky enough to have kids, will be one that will have seen progressive change. It will not be perfect. It will not be completely decolonized. I get that, but if I pass away and we've at least gone 2 steps forward, I will be thankful for at least that, instead of being stagnant or reversing like we're seeing in some places.
You know, I came across some articles that came out of Vancouver in, I guess it would be 1990s. And I can tell you, I know we're doing better just by the language and just the way that things were written. But God, it just seems so bad when, and it is hard to qualify that when I can then say, you know, Joey English, Cindy Gladue, Jackie Crazy Bull, Colton Bushi, and now we have new names to add to our trauma.
Yeah.
You know, that's just where we're at. So it's hard because I don't know what the right answer is, and I'm tired of telling people that we have names behind, not just names, like families behind every one of these names of, you know, children who will not have their mothers, or you know, brothers who can't have their sisters. Like, it's just, I'm so tired of trying to explain this, and then to have so much of Canada gaslight us and say, oh, that's not, we don't have racism in Canada. I'm hoping that next week will be a better week of hope. So,
crossing fingers.
Okay, this time for sure I gotta let you go. But I love you to pieces, Chad. So thank you for being on my show.
Back to you, okay?
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Bye.